Hello, you are listening to the Korea Pod. My name is Henry Shin. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you receive podcasts. It does help to get the word out, and we always appreciate the help in that endeavor. So today I want to talk about an issue that will be considered highly controversial. There's a lot of disagreement on it, and it will arouse a lot of anger depending on which side you land on the issue. And that is the question and the emergence recently, at least in recent years, of a group of radical feminists who have certainly had their voices heard. They are engaging in the public sphere, and they have angered a lot of people. And at the same time, they've also garnered a lot of support. If you've been following the news here in Korea, you'll know that there has been these weekly rallies that occur on the weekend. It started in Haewadong in northern Seoul, where you had a group of women protesting, and that protest has grown bigger and bigger by the week. And ultimately, they have decided to start protesting in central Seoul in Gwanghwamun. Now, the estimates to how many people have come out to these protests vary according to where you, again, if you're a detractor, you're going to say that there are far less people coming out on the streets and protesting. If you are a supporter of this movement, you will cite that many people, some say tens of thousands, maybe over 70,000, maybe close to 100,000, have participated in this event. Exclusively women. And the major theme of this protest is basically, we are not your pornographic material. That's what the women are saying. And basically, it is a protest. It is a call to action against the so-called mulka phenomenon in Korean society. This idea that men, these dirty, perverted men, are surreptitiously, secretly taping women, whether it is in a public space or whether they somehow manage to fit in a camera in a place where women can be in a more intimate setting, or they've somehow set up some kind of peeping Tom situation. And so they're outraged by this. They want this practice to stop. They don't want to see victims of these crimes no longer stay silent. And so on the surface, this seems like a very reasonable and very, very justified protest. You don't want to see a society that is rife with a bunch of perverted men snapping pictures of women or taping women through their phones with these video clips showing them in various states of undress and putting it out on the internet. It's a violation. It's a sexual assault, and it should be condemned by all facets of society. So I don't see a lot of debate there as to the question of whether it's right or wrong and whether these women should be aggrieved in terms of this idea of being a victim of these so-called secret peeping Tom camera crimes. The genesis of this protest, however, brought about because what these women are protesting and what they're angry about is not just the crimes committed against them with these peeping Toms and these secret cameras that are taping them. It's also this idea that the justice system in Korea, the judiciary, the police, the people investigating these crimes, they are biased, they are sexist, and they are definitely favoring men over women, because what they are outraged by is this recent case that occurred a few months ago where we had in the Hongdae area these nude models. Now, if you are somebody who's taking art classes, or if you're an artist yourself, you know that oftentimes you will have these classes where models will pose in the nude and you're supposed to draw them. This is sort of a common aspect of learning art, part of the educational process. And you know, all the juvenile jokes aside, this is really something that should be considered above board and not really something that should be considered too risque. However, there was an incident that occurred where the genitalia of a man was publicized online, and it, needless to say, generated a lot of outrage. The police investigated, and they were investigating this woman who happened to be the person that taped this man in the nude and blasted it online. It was later discovered that there was some kind of disagreement between the male model and the female model, and she was angry in a perhaps act of revenge. She taped this guy while he was nude. She blasted it online, a lot of mocking comments against this guy. And obviously, this guy was emotionally shattered by the event. The people in charge of the art class obviously were very much offended and embarrassed by the whole ordeal. And so the police got involved, and this woman was being prosecuted for that crime. But this generated a lot of outrage from the feminist community, from a particular feminist community, which said there are countless victims of women who are taped secretly. Their images are blasted online in the same way, and the police never try to prosecute those perpetrators, those perverted men. And so this is an unjust system. This is an unjust society, and we are going to take to the streets and decry this injustice and bring awareness and hopefully bring public support, media support, political support to our cause. And to a large extent, they've succeeded in that it is certainly high profile. Many media outlets are covering this event, and many of them are quite sympathetic to their cause. And for the wider public, unless you are someone who is inherently misogynistic, you will be supportive. On the surface, it is kind of a no-brainer. Obviously, you do want to see justice served for whoever commits these kind of crimes, these secret video or camera tapings of people who are nude or sexually explicit, and mock them and degrade them by putting those pictures online without their consent. So whether you're a man, whether you're female, if you are one of those people who are perpetrators in this crime, you should be certainly prosecuted. And if it is seen to be unfairly biased towards men, then that should also be a situation that should be rectified as well. So again, on the surface, no big disputes. However, what people have found is that under the surface, there's a lot of controversy with the certain more radical elements of this group protesting. And indeed, from that very beginning spark of this movement, where this woman who put that image of the naked man online and her being unfairly targeted while a bunch of other criminal men have gotten away scot-free, it brought a lot of attention to the group that this woman was a part of. So this female model was a member of a group called Womad. Now, this is where the discussion of the topic now kind of veers into very complicated, sordid, sort of very, very messy history. And it really deals with online communities and how they've emerged and how they've gained critical mass. Many people engaging with each other, posting images, posting comments, really growing to a point where you start to see civil war. So going all the way back to the beginning, and this is just going to be a very brief historical explanation of how Womad came to be. It really is kind of where you look at the genesis of all of this. It starts with an online community in Korea known as DC Inside. Now, DC Inside, DNC, it stands for digital camera. So very, very, very in its early days, in the early 2000s, DC Inside was an online community for enthusiasts of digital cameras. And so with the emergence of the digital camera technology, for your younger listeners, back in the old days when cameras were analog, you had to take a photo, you had to use film to process that photo. It was a very long and very cumbersome ordeal, and you didn't have any of these photos digitized because they were all in analog form. You had to print out these photographs on paper, and that's how we kept records of images. I know it sounds like caveman days, but with the emergence of digital cameras, there was, of course, an explosion of people on this new medium called the internet sharing these images to each other, and DC Inside happened to become one of the foremost groups, and it really, again, gained critical mass. There was really a huge following, again, initially with people sharing images and commenting with that online, talking about the technology of digital photography, exchanging tips with each other. But as this group evolved and as more and more people started joining this group and talking about various subjects, you saw that there was a diversification in what people talked about. Now, you might talk about digital photography, but after a while, maybe you get bored and you discuss other topics. You might talk about sports. You might talk about entertainment. You might talk about politics. And so that's where this evolution of DC Inside started to branch out into these various things. Now, this is not a discussion on Ilbe, which is another sort of offshoot of DC Inside, but Ilbe, Ilgan Best, was a subcategory of DC Inside where they would show like today's highlights or today's best topics. But this group started becoming more radicalized. It was largely male dominated, and they eventually split off. They were being, what they felt was being censored by DC Inside, and they formed their own group, which became this notorious group of young men known as Ilbe. They are notorious in Korea. They are really the precursors to the alt-right that we hear so much about in the U.S. media, but they do the same thing. They troll. They are almost extreme right-wing conservatives. They hate progressivism. They hate certain regions of the country, like the Honan region. They are highly misogynistic. And so that is one group that splintered off from DC Inside. Another group that splintered off from DC Inside eventually became a group that it was known as Magalia. And Magalia started out because there were a group of females who were talking about their own things. Again, DC Inside became this very diverse group. It was largely considered to be a progressive-leaning group of people. But there were a group of women who were talking about things. They started getting upset over, again, if you recall back in 2015, there was the outbreak of the MERS virus, which was this virus that originated from the Middle East, and it spread to an epidemic level here in Korea. Many people lost their lives. There was a report about how 2 women came from overseas. They were suspected of having contracted that disease, had a stopover in Hong Kong. And you saw a lot of comments from the DC Inside community very much deriding these 2 women, referring to them as kimchi ladies, which roughly translating these kind of superficial materialistic ladies who are only into shopping and luxury goods and whatnot. And so this group of women within DC Inside were pissed off about that. And so they started railing against these comments. They were upset about the injustice of pointing the finger at these 2 people being highly degrading and insulting toward these 2 females, and that growing chorus of feminist voices wanting to have a say in how the conversation was going eventually caused this splinter once again, and this group that was known as Magalia, they started their own site, just like Ilbe did, and they were known as the kind of foremost grouping of feminists online. Some people felt they were highly radical feminists, and they have had their own controversies as well. Some misandry referring to a dislike of men. But you probably would still categorize the group that was part of Magalia, this feminist group, as still being a progressive group. Now, they, again, despite all the controversies, you do have to credit them with certain things. They were largely responsible for being sort of the investigative journalists and the whistleblowers onto the atrocities that were occurring on another very controversial site, which was known as Soranet. And Soranet was this really nasty group of people who would post these pornographic images, even depicting pictures of sexual assault and rape, just a really disgusting online group of people who would post very, very provocative and disgusting images. And Magalia is largely credited with sort of kind of being the rallying call, really raising awareness until the other mainstream media outlets picked up on the story and leading to the pressure and the crackdown to where Soranet was eventually disbanded, and that site now has been completely now rendered inactive. So that is one of the things that Magalia has done that you could credit them as being a positive thing, despite their other controversies. But they were considered a feminist group. Some would say they were radical, and some would say that they were very, very left-wing feminist group. You would say maybe the stereotypical image that a lot of people who don't really follow the issues or who have some misgivings would think of as a feminist group here in Korea. Now, within Magalia, though, there was eventually another splinter. So among feminists, and there are, of course, if you think about things in terms of minority groups, if you're a feminist, if you're an ethnic minority, if you're a religious minority, you think they're all just this monolithic mass of people. And that's not the case. There's always diversity within groups. And so even within Magalia, there wasn't necessarily a uniform group of opinions on how to address issues or how to discuss issues. And one of the issues that became a dispute was the idea of how welcoming and how tolerant you were to the idea of LGBTQ. And so if you were somebody who was more progressive minded, you would welcome gay and lesbian people as part of your group and as being allies in your cause. However, there were a group of women within Magalia that wanted no part of that. And it is a term in the feminist lingo known as TERF, where the idea of transgender is considered abhorrent to certain feminists, and this is something that's in the West as well as in the East. But these intolerant women who disagreed with Magalia's overall policy of being more tolerant and open-minded to the other repressed or oppressed minorities like the LGBTQ community, that group of people who were anti-LGBTQ broke off and formed this group that we now know as Womad. And so this long, complicated explanation just to show the genesis of how Womad came to be. It started with this splinter from Magalia. They were highly derogatory towards gays. Magalia tried to ban this kind of content, so the women that were pissed off about that started their own group, Womad, and unfortunately, or depending on where you stand, if you're on their side, fortunately, they grew to be more prominent than Magalia eventually, where Magalia now really is an irrelevant entity, and Womad is really the only major group which would be considered under this radical feminist umbrella, at least on the online space. So what is Womad? What have they done? They've, again, been highly controversial, just to name some of the controversies they've been involved in, not just hating gay people, not just hating transsexuals. They are known for their highly misandrist content. Again, this hatred of men, including, let's say, prominent political figures. Or there was this very tragic incident when the popular actor Kim Joo-hyuk died in a car accident. There was a lot of mocking and disturbing content, basically having this sort of schadenfreude over the death of Kim Joo-hyuk being expressed in Womad. There were instances of and photos of things like killing men, stories about how they pushed men off the cliff, disturbing stories of women saying that they killed a man today by aborting their baby boy. This photos showing mutilated animals, saying that I killed a male, this animal. And so, yeah, I mean, just from that description alone, you would say pretty disturbing content. I would say the majority of people listening to this would say that is pretty disturbing stuff. So that is the kind of content that Womad trafficked in. There was one major controversy that occurred last year, and that was regarding this Australian resident, a Korean woman who was identified in the press as Adam Lee E. Adam. She claimed to have sexually molested a young boy, and that certainly caused, as you can expect, a huge outcry, outrage. It even involved the Australian Federal Police. They arrested her. They procured evidence, including pornographic material. And she is, of course, going to face the full brunt of the law. Now, the members of Womad have said that this is an injustice, that she's being unfairly persecuted, and they have filed appeals and tried to garner support in terms of raising legal funds and trying to make sure that Adam Lee is not unjustly prosecuted by the Australian court system. Now, that is one highly controversial case that made major news. In recent months, there's also been continuous controversies, including the infamous desecration of the Catholic communal wafer. This is a very, very sacrilegious event to defame this. There was very, very derogatory comments written on this desecrated, which is known as the host of Catholic rites. It was burned, and the Catholic community was very much offended by it. The Womad community was just saying everything is fair game, including all of our oppressors, which include all of the symbols of patriarchy, including the Catholic Church, including the political establishment, and some very disturbing comments and thoughts on the current president, Moon Jae-in. A lot of really, really highly inappropriate comments on freedom fighters like Kim Gu and An Jung-gun. And so they do a pretty good job of trolling the online community and generating this outrage and anger among people who might otherwise support the feminist movement or at least progressive ideals like gender equality, but because they are so outrageous in how they post this content or discuss things online, it is hard to find mainstream appeal for this group. Now, this group is part of the protest movement that we've seen with this anti-molka outcry, these women who are taking to the streets every weekend, and those numbers continuing to grow. It's one interesting aspect of that protest movement is that it is exclusionary, in meaning that only women are invited, even journalists, only women journalists are invited to cover the events, and that includes just as far as biological concerns, only females. So they will not accept anybody who is trans or transitioning or anyone who's considered binary. They just want biological born females to attend this kind of event. So right off the bat, you already see this discriminatory attitude taking place with this protest event. And a lot of people are conflating these wider protests with Womad. That may or may not be the case. Not all of the protesters might be passionate advocates of what Womad stands for. But the question of Womad, and this has been raised by a lot of people, including on the progressive side of things, if you listen to shows like News Kongjang, where the host Kim Ho-jun has been talking about this, and it really is walking a fine line because it's very sensitive. You do not want to be seen as being against the feminist movement and against the overall ideals of gender equality. But at the same time, you got to call out these things that are outrageous. And what Kim Ho-jun has been really banging the drum on is that this group is something different, that he suspects that there's something other, there's another force behind the emergence of Womad and these people who are advocating these things, because when he's talking about the desecration of the Catholic rights, the extreme mocking of public figures, the horrifically derogatory comments against people like President Moon Jae-in, against freedom fighters like An Jung-geun and Kim Gu, and the mocking of people like Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, what people like Kim Ho-jun have been saying is that you guys are supposed to be part of the overall progressive ideals of advocating for gender equality, but all you're showing is this extreme hatred towards men, but it doesn't go fully across the board. If you hate all men, that's one thing. But what people like Kim Ho-jun have been pointing out is that you guys don't seem to ever mention desecrating or demeaning or insulting images or comments or statements regarding these highly controversial heroes of the conservative movement, like Syngman Rhee, the first president of Korea, who led brutal crackdowns and tried to be dictator for life, or a real dictator, a military dictator like Park Chung-hee. You don't ever criticize them. In fact, one of their heroes and one of their major symbols of female victimhood is former President Park Geun-hye, who is in jail right now for these massive corruptive practices during her reign as president of South Korea. And they feel that she is an ally, and they portray her jailing and prosecution as being unjust and another example of an attack on women. So a lot of other normal, reasonable-minded people scratch their heads and say, this doesn't really make sense. It kind of makes you feel like upside down, what is right, what is left, what the heck is going on, what I thought about feminism, whether I support it or not, is completely opposite of what these women are trying to portray. Who do you stand for? Do you advocate for women's rights? But at the same time, if you hate men, why don't you hate men across the board? Why do you only hate men who are supposedly, nominally, ostensibly on your side of things? Maybe not to the extent that you want them to be, but people who are supportive of issues like gender equality, yet you seem to reserve your biggest ire and insults and horrific comments against those people, like the president of Korea right now, Moon Jae-in. Now, you might not agree with everything he does in terms of his policies and what he stands for politically, but you would certainly say that compared to his predecessors, like Lee Myung-bak or Park Geun-hye, that he stands more on the side of gender equality than any of those former presidents or other politicians. And so, yes, maybe progress isn't moving as fast as you would want, but he at least is somebody that wants to move towards a more egalitarian society. Yet, you refuse to criticize people like Syngman Rhee, who led this crackdown against thousands and thousands of people, who was one of the most anti-democratic leaders of this country, despite having this distinction of being the first leader of modern South Korea, or a military dictator like Park Chung-hee, who may be credited with leading the industrialization and economic growth of South Korea, but at the same time, at what cost? Trampling on democratic rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. And those are the symbols of male power that you refuse to call out or criticize. So what's at play here? Are people like Kim Ho-jun correct? Is there some other force, some element that is linked with the pro-Park Geun-hye movement that has somehow subverted this movement or is behind the power of this movement? These are all conspiracy theories to a certain extent, and these are things that we don't have evidence on. But just looking at the evolution of how this group came to prominence and how they have now really become very prominent in the public eye, and how they may have been very savvy in the way they've portrayed themselves in the media, at least with these public rallies on the streets, where the mainstream media seem to have largely portrayed them in a somewhat positive light, at least for these women who say that they do not want to be the subject of pornographic exploitation. It's an issue that everyone can agree with. But beneath that surface, this driving force behind it, whether it is Womad or whether it's people that think similarly like Womad, there are some very disturbing elements, like I just described. And again, there are questions as to what exactly their motivations are, what exactly their actual ambitions and goals are, and whether that overall is good for Korean society. You hate to see this big split between men who feel now they are being targeted and who feel somehow that they are losing their inherent power in society. And if you see this bigger backlash and this false equivalency between this disgusting, highly misogynistic alt-right group like Ilbe being conflated with feminists as a whole, even though it's only this subgroup, this minority Womad that is really driving the more disturbing elements of it, that's going to be a shame, because the drive for the Me Too movement, for gender equality, should be something that could be universally supported. However, if it is now being subverted, if it's being corrupted, if it's being delayed or detracted from because of the very, very negative connotations associated with Womad, and that really drives or delays the movement and the goals of feminism in the long term, that's going to be something that could be considered tragic for the midterm, for the long term, for the future of Korean society, as everyone who does believe in progressive ideals would like to see a more egalitarian society. And hopefully, if you get to the bottom of it and you see saner voices say that whatever Womad stands for, that is not what I stand for. I stand for equality, and I stand for the genders to eventually be equal, to live in harmony. And if Womad is a part of it, we can't be a part of the discussion. Let's hope that cooler heads prevail and we see people come to a consensus and accept and be savvy and smart enough to know that you can be for gender equality, but you can also be against all of the disturbing things that a group like Womad advocates. Again, controversial. Not everyone's going to agree, and it's a debate that probably will have to continue in the weeks, months, maybe years to come. All right, we're going to leave it there. Hope you enjoyed it. My name is Henry Shin. We'll be back with another edition of the Korea Pod. Until then, goodbye.